By the time they burst out of the blackness above Hogsmeade, the night had narrowed to three things: wind, pain, and the faltering weight of Albus Dumbledore leaning against Harry Potter's shoulder. Harry had thought in the cave that he had reached the furthest edge of fear. He had watched Dumbledore drink agony by the goblet until his voice broke and his body shook, and the great magician, who had always seemed made of something finer and harder than ordinary flesh, begged for mercy in a stranger's raw, ruined tone. He had fought the Inferi in black water under the livid flare of fire that should have belonged to some wrathful god and not to any man. He had dragged the heavy false locket from the basin and listened to Dumbledore's ragged breath as they returned to the rock where apparition was possible again. He had been wrong. Fear still had ground to cover. They staggered into the deserted high street like two castaways thrown up on stone. Hogsmeade lay under starlight, and the kind of silence that was not peace but interruption, as if the village had been forced to hold its breath. Windows were dark. Rain from earlier in the evening still clung in shallow silver on the cobbles. Somewhere a sign creaked on its chain. The smell of brine from the sea cave clung to their clothes, mingling with soot from distant chimneys and the sharp metallic reek of spilled magic. Dumbledore nearly went to one knee. Harry caught him under the shoulders, horrified by the brittle frailty of the body beneath the robes. The headmaster was cold with sweat. His cursed hand, blackened and shriveled, hung at an angle that looked almost separate from him, as though the darkness in it had begun to claim the arm entire and was only pausing out of cruelty. "Professor." "No," Dumbledore whispered, and the word was no more than breath. "Up." Harry followed the direction of his gaze. The dark mark burned above Hogwarts. It did not merely hang in the sky. It seemed branded into the night itself, a green wound high over the Astronomy Tower, skull and serpent floating with obscene serenity above the sleeping school. For one absurd instant, Harry thought of the first time he had seen it, above the Quidditch World Cup campsite, and how impossible it had seemed that something so huge and dreadful could belong to the same world as tents and laughter and summer grass. Here it was over the castle he had once believed the safest place in existence. The distance between then and now felt like the distance between two lives. Dumbledore straightened by an act of will alone. Harry felt it happen under his hand like the setting of a cracked bone. Something of the old authority returned to the old man's posture, though the body it inhabited was failing him. "They have chosen their hour well," he said. The quietness of it was worse than panic would have been. "We have very little time." Harry wanted to say that he could run to the school, raise the alarm, find Snape, find McGonagall, find anyone. But the name that leapt up first in his mind, Snape, brought with it the memory of Trelawney's half-heard prophecy and Dumbledore's recent insistence on trust. And everything became for a moment a confusion of loyalties he had never accepted, and now had no time to question. Dumbledore's head turned toward the three broomsticks. Through the diamond panes of an upper window, warm amber light showed where a lamp had been left burning. Behind the bar stood Madame Rosmerta, motionless as a figure painted on glass. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and the effort of each word was visible in the tendons of his throat. "Help me to the door." They crossed the street, Dumbledore leaning more heavily with every step. At the threshold he lifted his wand, and though the movement made his face whiten, the lock sprang at once. Inside, the familiar pub smelled of ale, old wood, and a banked kitchen fire. Chairs stood upside down on tables. Rosmerta turned when they entered, but no recognition stirred in her face. Her eyes were wide and empty, the irises dulled, as if someone stood behind them and looked out with cold patience. "Imperious," Dumbledore murmured. "Poor lady." He spoke to her in a low voice Harry could barely hear, gentler than a command and firmer than a plea. Rosmerta blinked once, twice, like a sleeper dragged partway toward waking. Dumbledore's wand trembled. Harry saw sweat gather at his temple. A broom rose from its peg behind the bar, then another from the narrow back room. Rosmerta's fingers twitched around the polishing cloth in her hand. "Madam," Dumbledore said, "if you remember anything of this night, remember only that you resisted." Her empty gaze followed him as if she understood the kindness but had been placed too far away to answer. Harry took both brooms, shoved one awkwardly toward Dumbledore, and watched him smile, faint and absurdly apologetic at the necessity. "I fear," Dumbledore said, "that dignity must wait." They rose into the night above Hogsmeade, not gracefully, but with the urgent, uneven lift of people who could not afford to fall. Harry had flown in storms, in Quidditch finals, under dragonfire. None of that felt like this. The wind knifed cold through his soaked clothes. His broom handle was slick under his palms. Beside him, Dumbledore rode hunched and silent, robes snapping like torn sailcloth, white beard streaming backward. The dark mark floated ahead over the castle, reflected here and there in black lake water between the turrets like something drowned and luminous rising toward the surface. Hogwarts loomed larger with frightening speed. Harry saw lit windows and others dark. He saw the battlements of the Astronomy Tower cut against the green stain in the sky. He saw no figures moving there. The stillness made everything worse. They landed hard on the upper rampart near the tower stairs. Harry leapt off at once and turned in time to catch Dumbledore again. The headmaster's legs gave beneath him for one awful second. His breath hitched in his chest. "You must go," Harry said. "I'll get somebody. McGonagall, Tonks, anyone?" "No." Dumbledore's eyes behind the half-moon spectacles were suddenly very clear. "No one else before we know what waits above." There was no arguing with that voice when it came, even so frayed. They climbed. The spiral stairs seemed without end. Stone curved upward and upward under their feet, old as the school itself, worn shallow in the center by generations. Harry's shoulder ached with Dumbledore's weight. Twice he thought the older man would collapse entirely. Once Dumbledore's free hand slid to the wall, and Harry saw his fingers press against a block of stone carved with a nearly vanished starburst. It looked like nothing, but something in the deliberate touch fixed itself in Harry's mind without his knowing why. The higher they went, the stronger the night wind became, pouring down the stairwell in mournful gusts. Above them somewhere a door banged and banged again. The dark mark's green light spilled brokenly through the slit windows, painting Dumbledore's lined face in corpse colors. When they reached the top landing, the door to the battlements stood open. Harry never knew afterward whether Dumbledore heard footsteps beneath them, or simply felt the approaching shape of events. One instant, they were alone on the threshold. The next, Dumbledore moved with a speed so unnatural after all his weakness that Harry barely understood what he had seen. A hand like a claw gripped Harry's arm, turned him, shoved him back against the wall. There was a whispered spell, a flash like cold silver at the edge of vision, and Harry's body locked from throat to heel. He did not fall only because Dumbledore had already caught the front of his robes and propped him upright. Then the invisibility cloak was whipped from Harry's clenched hand and flung over him so swiftly that night seemed to double around him. Dumbledore's face came close, pale and terribly old under the greenish sky. "Be still," he breathed. "And whatever you see, remember." There was no time to ask what. There was not even time to be angry. Dumbledore had turned away, crossing the moonlit top of the tower with one hand against the battlement to steady himself. By the time the first figure emerged from the stair, Harry could not move so much as a finger. Draco Malfoy came into the moonlight like a boy who had walked too far into his own nightmare, and found, to his astonishment, that it knew his name. His wand was out. His face, narrow and usually pale, had gone beyond pallor into something almost translucent. Sweat shone on his upper lip. His chest heaved as if he had run a great distance, though he could only have climbed the stairs. His gray eyes, fixed on Dumbledore, were wide with triumph, terror, and a kind of unbelieving appeal, as though part of him still expected the older man to smile and turn the whole thing into a lesson. Expelliarmus! Dumbledore's wand flew in a high arc over the battlements and vanished into darkness below. Harry's heart slammed once so hard in his petrified body that he thought he might black out from the force of it. Dumbledore, disarmed, swayed, then caught himself against the parapet with the blackened hand. The dark mark burned above them. Draco's wand shook. For a moment no one spoke. Then Dumbledore said, very softly, "Good evening, Draco." The absurd civility of the greeting made Draco flinch. Whatever speech he had prepared for this moment, something scornful, perhaps, or grandly threatening, some echo of his father's smooth contempt, fell to pieces in him at once. He swallowed. His wand moved half an inch higher. "You're not going to get away this time," he said. The words came out thin and almost childish. Harry remembered Draco on the Hogwarts Express in their first year, offering friendship with a sneer and a pale hand. Remembered Draco boasting in corridors, posturing on broomsticks, laughing over others' humiliation. There had always been something rehearsed about him, as if he played a role handed to him at birth, and feared what might happen if he ever forgot his lines. For the first time, Harry saw nakedly the fear behind it. Dumbledore saw it too. That was obvious. He seemed to see very little else. "No?" he said. "Then we are both in difficulties." Draco's mouth twisted. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Talking to me like—" He broke off, and his voice rose suddenly. "Like I'm in first year and I've done something stupid in potions. I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" Dumbledore asked. The question was almost gentle. Draco's breathing quickened. Below them, far below, there came the muffled swell of voices from the castle, and then silence again. Harry strained against his immobility until pain burned through his shoulders. Nothing gave. He could only listen. "You know I've fixed it," Draco said. "You know I've done what he wanted." "Yes," said Dumbledore. "You found a way to let murder into my school." Draco licked dry lips. "You don't know everything." "Not everything," Dumbledore agreed. "But more than you suppose. The necklace. The poisoned maid. Madame Rosmerta, compelled and frightened. The cabinet in the room of requirement. You have worked very hard, Draco." "Me." That, more than accusation would have, seemed to shake the boy. His eyes flickered. "You knew," he said. "I suspected. Then I knew. And you didn't stop me?" "I wished," said Dumbledore, "to stop you without destroying you." For the first time, anger flared hot through Draco's fear. "Don't talk as if you care what happens to me." "But I do care," said Dumbledore. "That is the inconvenience." The wind rushed around the tower, carrying the smell of pine from the forest and smoke from somewhere below. Draco's hair, white blonde in the moonlight, lifted off his forehead and settled again. His hand wavered. The tip of his wand trembled visibly. "He'll kill me," Draco said at last. The words were so naked that Harry almost shut his eyes. Dumbledore did not move nearer. He remained where he was, one shoulder against the ancient stone, weakened to the edge of collapse, and yet somehow making the tower seem arranged around his stillness. "Not tonight," he said. Draco laughed, and the sound had no humor in it at all. "You can't protect me. He'll know if I fail?" "He always knows." "There are more ways to fail a master than by disobedience," Dumbledore said. "And more ways to defeat him than killing him with a wand. Lower yours, Draco. Come with me. You and your mother can be hidden before dawn. There are places he cannot reach easily, people he has underestimated all his life. Give me that much, and I may yet save 2 souls tonight." At the mention of Narcissa, Draco's whole face altered. For a second he looked heartbreakingly young. Then footsteps sounded on the stair below, heavy and hurried, and terror seized him again. "No," he said. "No, it's too late." Dumbledore's eyes shifted toward the stair, then back. Harry saw his left hand, the uninjured one, slide along the parapet until the fingertips rested lightly on a weather-eaten groove in the stone. It might have meant nothing. It might have been balance. Yet there was intention in it. "Rarely," Dumbledore said, "is it as late as one thinks." The first of the others burst onto the battlements then, and scattered the fragile paws between them like glass. Amicus Carrow came grinning, thick-bodied and brutal, with Alecto just behind him, her face eager and sharp. Behind them shoved a broad, dark man Harry did not at first recognize and then wished he had not. Fenrir Greyback, though not transformed, with his teeth too long to belong to any ordinary smile. Another Death Eater crowded after, panting from the climb, his mask pushed up and sweat pouring from his face. They smelled of damp wool, cheap scent, and violence. "Well, well," said Amecus, taking in the scene. "The little prince did it." Draco's expression, if Amicus had looked, would have told any honest man the boast was misplaced. But honesty had nothing to do with any of them. Dumbledore inclined his head as though receiving ill-mannered callers. "Amicus, Alecto, Greyback. I had hoped for better company." Greyback's nostrils flared. His eyes had fixed on Dumbledore's throat. Harry felt a sick jolt of hatred. "You'll do," Greyback said. "If its blood were about." "Not yours," Dumbledore said. Something in the quiet certainty of the reply made Greyback bare his teeth. Amicus turned to Draco. "Get on with it, then." Draco did not move. Alecto clicked her tongue. "Look at his handshake. He's gone soft." "I'm not soft," Draco snapped, but his wand wavered worse than ever. He swallowed again. "I can do it." Dumbledore watched him with an expression Harry had seen only once or twice before, in moments when some suffering person had stood before him stripped of all pretense. It was not pity exactly. It was more difficult than that. It left no room for contempt. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "You can. The question is what will remain of you if you do." Amicus barked a laugh. "He'll remain alive, that's what." "Will he?" Dumbledore's gaze shifted not to Amicus, but somewhere past him, down the stair, as if listening for a tread he knew among all others. One does not keep such masters by proving useful ones. Draco's face shone wetly now. Harry realized with something like astonishment that the boy was close to tears. "My father," Draco began, and stopped. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "Your father has made errors. You need not repeat them." That struck too deeply. Draco made a noise between rage and despair. "You think you know everything about my family." "I know enough," Dumbledore said. "I know your mother loves you. I know your father's pride has set fire to your life. I know that you do not want to kill me." Amicus stepped forward, impatient. "Move aside, then." "No," Draco said, sudden and sharp. He did not lower his wand, but he moved half a step as if to bar the others. "It's mine." Harry, bound and invisible, felt a convulsive, useless rush of hope. Dumbledore must have felt it too. Something imperceptible gentled in his face. "Draco," he said. And now there was a deeper note in his voice. Not command, but urgency. "Listen to me very carefully. When the next man comes through that door, do nothing that cannot be undone." Draco stared. The footsteps on the stairs reached the top. Severus Snape came onto the battlements in black, moving quickly, and then stopping all at once as the moonlight took the scene and laid it bare before him. Dumbledore disarmed and weakened against the parapet, Draco white-faced and shaking, Death Eaters crowding the stair-mouth, the skull mark burning overhead, and all the accumulated consequence of many bargains meeting in one narrow place. Harry could not see Snape's eyes clearly at that distance, but he saw the instantaneous change in the man's face. It did not harden, not at first. For the briefest fraction of a second it looked as if something in him had given way entirely, something pulled too tight for too long. Then the familiar mask descended, smooth and unreadable. "Severus," said Dumbledore. And then, with a weight in the name that Harry later would remember and understand in 10 different ways, "Please." Snape's wand came up. Snape looked at Dumbledore for one heartbeat too long. Harry would remember that heartbeat afterward more vividly than the curse itself. There were things in it that no one on the tower except the two men could have named. Old promises, old grievances, the knowledge of a death long rehearsed, and suddenly made strange by the possibility that it might yet be escaped. Snape's face did not betray any of this. but the delay existed. Harry felt it like the held breath before lightning. Then Snape moved. Avada Kedavra! Green light rushed across the tower. At that same instant, something else answered from the stones beneath Dumbledore's hand. For a single, impossible moment, the world split in two. Harry saw the curse streak forward, vicious and unanswerable. And he saw also a pale shape tear itself up out of shadow at Dumbledore's side, as if the tower had cast his likeness from its own moonlit face. Red gold fire roared around the battlements with the beat of vast wings. The borrowed figure, robe, beard, broken posture, all of him, took the curse full in the chest and was hurled backward over the parapet. There were shouts. Amicus swore. Draco made a sound like something struck in the body. Harry saw a white hand, a flash of silver spectacles, robes snapping outward in the green light, and then the falling shape was gone beyond the edge, dropping into the darkness below. Scarlet feathers whirled through the air and vanished. By the time Harry blinked against the brilliance, the battlements held only empty space where Dumbledore had stood. Snape spun on the others with murderous speed. Go! Now! It was exactly what they expected of him, and yet so violent that even Amicus obeyed without argument. Greyback laughed low in his throat, feral with the taste of coming panic in the castle. Alecto backed for the stair. Draco had not moved. His face was gray. Draco! Snape barked. The name seemed to strike him into action. Draco stumbled after the others. Snape followed, and as he passed Harry's hidden place, his wand flicked once. So slight a movement, Harry would have missed it if terror had not sharpened the world to needles. The paralysis vanished. Harry lunged forward, ripping off the invisibility cloak, but Snape was already at the stair. He snatched for the fallen wand he thought must still lie on the tower, forgetting for one frantic instant that it had flown over the battlements. Nothing met his hand. The emptiness was like another blow. Then rage carried him after the retreating figures. They thundered downward in a chaos of footsteps and flying black robes, Snape driving them faster, Harry hurling curses after them. His first missed in the turn of the stairwell and blew chunks from the wall. His second sent sparks over Amicus's shoulder. Someone below screamed that the school was rousing. Stupefy! Snape blocked without looking back. The spell shattered against the curve of his shield and sprayed blue-white light over the cramped stone. Harry charged after them, not thinking, only following the black back ahead of him with a hatred so complete it tasted metallic at the root of his tongue. They burst from the tower into the open night. All over the grounds, the consequences of the breach were unfolding. Shouts rang from the castle. Windows blazed awake one after another. Somewhere to the left, a bell clanged erratically. Farther off, near Hagrid's cabin, orange flames climbed in a sudden gout and threw monstrous shadows over the lawn. The scent of burning wood struck Harry like a hand to the face. The Death Eaters scattered toward the outer boundary, some firing spells behind them almost for sport. One clipped a stone gargoyle near the entrance and sent fragments spinning. Another blasted a window. Students were screaming somewhere inside. Harry heard women's voices calling names. "After them!" he shouted, though no one yet stood near enough to hear. He sprinted across the grass. Ahead, Snape had one hand clamped around Draco's upper arm hard enough to drag him half off balance, steering him downhill away from the castle. Amicus and Alecto crashed through a flower bed to the right. Greyback loped with inhuman ease, turning his head once to grin over his shoulder at the fire taking hold of Hagrid's wooden walls. Harry raised his wand. Sectum. No! The word cracked through the night like a whip. Snape had wheeled with a speed that should have been impossible while dragging another body. His own wand lashed downward. Harry's curse was knocked aside before it fully formed, gouging a smoking trench in the lawn. "You dare use my own spells against me?" Snape's voice carried in the open air, cold and cutting. "You have no understanding of what you fling about, Potter." Harry was beyond listening. Croak. But Snape blocked again. The recoil jarred Harry's arm to the shoulder. Draco stumbled, nearly fell, and Snape hauled him upright without looking, every line of his body saying furious urgency rather than fear. Behind Harry there came pounding feet. Someone from the castle at last. But he did not turn. The world had reduced itself to the man before him and the unendurable fact of what had happened on the tower. "You killed him!" One of the side doors of Hagrid's hut burst open. Hagrid came plunging out through smoke, giant frame outlined red by the flames chewing up his doorframe. Fang yelped somewhere inside. Hagrid roared with fury, snatched a bucket in one enormous hand, found it absurdly useless against that blaze, and threw it aside. When he saw Harry racing after Snape, he bellowed a name that the wind tore to pieces. Snape's expression did something strange then. Not softened. Never that. But some exhausted contempt for the entire scene flickered through it, as if he had long expected to be hated for exactly this, and now found the reality no easier than the anticipation. "Go back," he said. It was not an order barked in triumph. It sounded almost like warning. Harry answered with another curse. Snape deflected that too. None of the spells Harry cast seemed to reach him cleanly. The more furious Harry became, the more immaculate Snape's defense. At one point, Greyback, glancing back from farther ahead, raised his own wand toward Harry with a savage grin. Snape struck his arm down so viciously that the cursed Greyback fired blasted a crater into the earth instead. "Keep moving," Snape snarled, and for an instant it sounded less like command to an ally than hatred towards something he refused to name. They had reached the dark edge of the grounds, where the protection line thinned and the land sloped toward the lane to Hogsmeade. Behind Harry, the castle shone with new lights. Voices were multiplying. Harry knew, in the margin of sense left to him, that help was coming too late. "You're a coward," he shouted. Snape stopped as if the word had been physical. He turned fully then. Draco tore free of his grip and nearly fell again, staring between them with something like panic. The Death Eaters ahead faltered. Firelight from Hagrid's cabin, green glow from the dark mark, and pale moonlight all met on Snape's face, turning it into a harsh, angular mask. "No," Snape said, and the restraint in it was more terrible than a shout. "Do not use that word for me." Harry would have thrown himself bodily at him if magic failed. He flung another curse instead. Snape cut it aside with contemptuous precision. "You think bravery is noise and fury and a wand waved without thought," he said. "You think the world sorts itself into noble fools and plain villains, because that saves you the labor of judgment." Harry had no answer except hatred. "Fight me!" "I am fighting," Snape said, and something dark and bitter crossed his face, gone so quickly Harry thought later he might have imagined it. "Against much that you cannot yet comprehend." Then, with a vicious finality that was half shield and half wound, he added, "I am the Half-Blood Prince." It meant nothing and everything at once. Shock checked Harry for one impossible instant. Snape used it. He seized Draco again, backed the last pace across the boundary where apparition was possible, and vanished with a crack that seemed to tear the night. Amicus and Electo followed. Greyback went last, grinning, and then he too was gone. Harry stood on the edge of the ground, shaking so hard his teeth clicked together. Behind him, the fire at Hagrid's cabin was being subdued by converging jets of water and extinguishing charms. The dark mark still floated above the tower like a verdict. Then Hagrid made a sound that Harry had never heard from him before and would never forget. It was not a shout and not quite a sob. It was the breaking noise a giant might make when grief proved heavier than strength. Harry turned. At the foot of the Astronomy Tower, in the grass silvered by moonlight and trampled by running feet, lay the still shape in pale robes. Hagrid was already on his knees beside it. Albus came back to himself in a room that smelled of old beer, soap, dust, and goat. Pain greeted him before memory did. It spread outward from the cursed hand in cold black threads, met the aftershock of the potion still clawing at his nerves, and joined the bruising force with which the castle's hidden escape enchantment had hurled him sideways out of danger and into transit. Every rib seemed separately acquainted with misery. His mouth tasted of salt, bile, and blood. When he tried to breathe deeply, the world grayed at the edges. A voice, rough as gravel under rain, said, "Don't be clever enough to die before I've had the chance to tell you what an idiot you are." Albus opened his eyes. The ceiling above him slanted sharply. The room was small, plainly furnished, long out of fashion and long out of use by the look of it. The wallpaper had once been blue, and now had the washed-out patience of old cloth. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chest with one broken handle. Candlelight thinned and thickened in a draught coming under the door. On the sill sat Fawkes, feathers dimmed to ember colors in the poor light, head tilted, ancient eyes fixed on his master with a grief too wise to be dramatic. Aberforth stood at the bedside with his arms folded. He had aged into his brother's bones by another road entirely. Where Albus had become all silver angles and scholar's gravity, Aberforth had thickened into stubbornness. Weathered hands, beard like torn wool, eyes that carried the same piercing blue as Albus, but none of the habit of mercy. Those eyes were bloodshot now. Whether from drink, sleeplessness, or fear was not immediately clear. "Ah," Albus whispered. "Then I am certainly alive." Aberforth stared at him as if debating whether to strike him. "Only just." Albus attempted a smile and discovered at once that his face objected. He let it go. "I must ask your forgiveness for the manner of my arrival." "You arrived in a blaze through a room I've kept shut for 20 years, Aberforth said. "Forgiveness is not the first thing coming to mind." Albus turned his head slightly, and the motion showed him the far wall. A faded girl's ribbon still hung from a nail beside the door. On the mantel stood a chipped china vase with no flowers in it. Dust lay gently everywhere except where Aberforth's hands, rough and impatient, had disturbed it. Ariana's room, then. Preserved not out of sentimentality, which Aberforth would have despised in the abstract, but from some harder, quieter refusal to let the world grind every trace of her to nothing. For 1 week heartbeat shame struck as freshly as if the years since Godric's Hollow had not passed. "A fitting refuge," Albus murmured. Aberforth's face hardened. "Don't you start with me in here." Fawkes made a low sound in his throat and hopped from the sill to the bedpost. Warm tears, bright as liquid garnet in the candlelight, fell once, twice, onto the edge of the blackened hand. The curse did not lift, but the cold in the arm lessened. Albus exhaled carefully. "You had warning?" Aberforth said after a moment. "A little." Speech cost effort. He kept it spare. "Enough to ask the tower for assistance. Enough to ask for your room." "No. You asked," Aberforth said, "as if I'd refuse a dying man with my face. Would you have?" "Depends which face." "Despite everything," Albus laughed once. It hurt abominably. Aberforth's mouth twitched and then set again. "What happened?" he asked. Albus closed his eyes briefly, not from weariness but to order the answer. The sequence had been measured, argued over, revised, and hoped against between himself and Severus in quieter nights than this. Yet the reality of it had possessed a terror the plan did not. Draco's shaking wand. Severus's stricken pause. Harry frozen against the wall, believing himself abandoned. One could calculate a war. One could not calculate the cost exacted by individual moments in it. "The arrangement succeeded," he said at last. "Enough of it, at least." "Meaning?" "Meaning the world believes me dead." Aberforth let out a sound without mirth. "You always did like to go about things the dramatic way. There was nothing theatrical in it. There's a white beard in the grass at Hogwarts because you've taught a castle to lie and a phoenix to keep time, and you say there's nothing theatrical in it?" Albus opened his eyes again. Harry must believe it too. For now. The room quieted. Even Aberforth's anger shifted under the weight of that. "Because of the connection." "Yes." Aberforth looked away first. His hand went to the back of a chair standing near the wall. "And if he finds out by accident, then we shall all pay dearly." Comforting. Albus watched Fawkes settle his scarlet body more closely against the bedpost. Severus must remain above suspicion. Draco must not become a murderer. Voldemort must commit himself to a victory he believes complete. Those were the necessities. "You forgot one," Aberforth said. "You must not actually die." Poppies of black flecked the edges of Albus's sight again. He let his head sink deeper into the pillow for a moment. The curse in the hand pulsed like a second sick heartbeat. "The ring still keeps its bargain," he said quietly. "I have bought time, not life, but perhaps enough." That answer, more than any wound, frightened Aberforth. He covered it at once with anger. "You are not going to leave me with your plans half done and the country on fire." "No intention of it." "Good. Then hear mine." Aberforth leaned down until their faces were close, and for an instant, he looked not old at all but like the fierce young man Albus had once known, the one who had loved too simply to survive the complexity of their household. "You do not get to use this room and then start keeping things from me because they're for my own good. You've spent a lifetime deciding what knowledge other people can bear. Try it again, Albus, and I'll tip your bed out the window myself." Albus met his brother's gaze and inclined his head as far as the pillow allowed. "Agreed." Aberforth straightened, suspicious of any agreement reached too quickly. "I need Minerva," Albus said. "Kingsley as well. And Poppy, if she can be trusted to curse me only after she has mended me." Denshire. "Can they come unseen?" "They must." "And the boy?" A pulse of sharper pain answered before Albus could. "Not from the cursed hand this time, but from a place no healing draught could reach." "No," he said. "Not yet. Especially not him." Aberforth rubbed both hands down his face. "Hell grieve you." "Yes." "Hell hates Snape." "Yes. And you're asking for that." "I am asking," Albus said with more effort than any word that night had cost him, "for a little while in which hatred may keep him safe." The candle nearest the bed guttered. Fawkes spread one wing, and the flame steadied again. Aberforth stood silent long enough that Albus thought he might refuse after all. Then he gave a short, savage nod. "I'll fetch them," he said. "And if you fall dead while I'm gone, I'll never forgive you." When he had gone, the small room widened with absence. Albus lay listening to the noises beneath. A door opening in the pub, a burst of rough laughter quickly gone, the clink of glass, the scrape of a chair. Life continuing, indifferent and indispensable. He turned his head toward Fawkes. "Did I ask too much of him?" he whispered. The phoenix answered not with song but by stepping, impossibly delicately, onto the bed and laying his bright head against the old man's shoulder. Albus closed his eyes. Behind the lids he saw Harry on the tower, unable to move, seeing only the most cruel surface of things. It was precisely the memory he had hoped to avoid leaving the boy, and precisely the one he had now given him. There was no comfort in knowing it necessary. Necessity was often only another word for wounds one decided to inflict in advance. Grief at 16 was not noble. It was not composed, nor articulate, nor touched by any of the solemnity adults like to imagine in the bereaved. It was ugly, repetitive, furious. It noticed stupid things and clung to them because the larger fact could not be held whole in the mind without splitting it open. Harry noticed as Hagrid bore the body into the castle that one of Dumbledore's sleeves had ridden back from the wrist and that the cuff was slightly frayed. He noticed that the silver buckle on Hagrid's enormous boot was hanging loose. He noticed that a torch bracket on the wall by the entrance had been polished recently enough to throw back orange firelight in a wavering line. None of these things had anything to do with death. They were simply what his mind could manage while the rest of him howled soundlessly around them. The entrance hall was chaos. Students clustered on the marble steps in dressing gowns and hurriedly donned robes, many barefoot, some crying openly, some staring blankly toward Hagrid's burden as if the eye could refuse what the rest of the body already knew. Professors moved among them, driving them back, counting, questioning, sending prefects for those still unaccounted for. The great doors stood open to the night. Damp air, and the smell of charred wood came in with everyone returning from the grounds. Minerva McGonagall descended the staircase at speed, skirts gathered in one hand, and stopped dead when she saw Hagrid. For a second all her discipline shattered so thoroughly that Harry thought she might faint. One hand flew to her mouth. Then she mastered herself with visible violence and came forward. "Hagrid," she said. There was no order in the word, only appeal. Hagrid lowered the body carefully onto a conjured stretcher, because even his strength had begun to fail under grief. McGonagall knelt. Her hand hovered above the still face, and then, after a terrible hesitation, touched the brow very lightly. When she rose, she seemed 20 years older. "Hospital wing," she said, though there was no purpose in it except privacy. At once, Harry went with them because there was nowhere else in the world to go. They moved through corridors lit too brightly, every torch and lamp seeming newly cruel in its cheerfulness. People pressed themselves against the walls to let the stretcher pass. Some gasped. Some bowed their heads. One Ravenclaw girl made a small moan and was held upright by her friend. Harry walked beside Hagrid and never once took his eyes from the face on the pillow. It looked like Dumbledore. Of course it did. The lined brow, the nose that had been broken and not perfectly reset, the beard, the half-moon spectacles, the blackened hand folded over the chest. Yet something in Harry, already deranged by shock, kept snagging on a strange stillness beneath the resemblance, as though the body possessed all the appearance of the man and none of the restless inward brightness that had once made even sleep look temporary in him. He hated himself at once for the thought. Death did that. Death emptied. There was nothing strange in emptiness. The hospital wing had become triage. Bill Weasley sat propped against pillows with his face and throat laid open in brutal clawed gouges that Madame Pomfrey was trying furiously to mend. Fleur Delacour stood beside him, white as candle wax and fierce enough to terrify anyone foolish enough to suggest she depart. Ron, Hermione, and Ginny were there, clothes crookedly pulled on, faces blanched. Neville stood with one sleeve scorched. Luna, unaccountably tidy in the midst of disaster, held a basin of blood-stained water and watched everyone with eyes full of grave, drifting sorrow. Remus Lupin stood near Bill's bed with his wand still in hand, expression taut as wire. Conversation stopped when the stretcher entered. Ginny made a sound and clapped both hands over her mouth. Ron looked as if someone had punched the breath out of him. Hermione's face crumpled immediately. Tears spilled before she seemed to know they were coming. Harry felt their grief reach for his and found distantly that he could not bear to be touched by it. If he let anyone else's sorrow in, his own might turn liquid and drown him. Madame Pomfrey looked up from Bill, saw the stretcher, and swayed. "No," she said sharply, as if contradiction remained possible. "No, absolutely not. This is—" She did not finish. She crossed the room in 3 strides and laid her fingers to the throat beneath the beard. Her professional expression held for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it broke, and she shut her eyes. "Screen him off," McGonagall said, her voice thin but steady. "Please." Privacy curtains billowed into place. Harry would have stepped through them if anyone had tried to stop him. No one did. Inside the enclosed space, the world became small. A narrow bed, white linen, the quiet form on it, the sound of Hagrid crying under his breath, like a man trying not to frighten children. McGonagall stood at the foot of the bed with both hands clenched into the folds of her tartan dressing gown. She seemed to be forcing herself to look directly at Dumbledore, in the same way one forces oneself to hold a gaze at a funeral instead of letting it dart away. "He must not remain here long," Madame Pomfrey said eventually, and her voice was raw. "The children—" "No," McGonagall agreed. "No, we will arrange something else." Harry heard none of it properly. He had moved to the bedside and was staring at the blackened hand. He had known about the injury for months. He had seen it, asked about it, been put off with evasions. Yet now it seemed to contain the whole hidden catastrophe of the year in miniature, the evidence of a price paid out of sight while everyone else went about their ordinary days in ignorance. "What happened?" Hermione whispered behind him. Harry found that he could answer only in fragments. The cave. The locket. The mark. Draco. Snape. He said Snape's name and his own voice changed into something harsh enough that Ron made a sound of anger at once. "I'll kill him," Ron said. "No," Lupin said sharply from outside the curtain. "You will not. He killed. I know what he did." Harry turned. Lupin's face, always lined by restraint, had become all planes and exhaustion. There was grief there, yes, but also something else. A terrible alertness, the dawning comprehension of what Dumbledore's death would mean not only personally but strategically, politically, morally. One man gone, and an entire line of defense redrawn in darkness. "Harry," Lupin said, quieter, "tell me exactly what happened on the tower." Harry did, or tried. Again he stumbled over the same impossibility. Snape's arrival. Dumbledore's pleas. The green light. The fall. His own helplessness. Saying it aloud turned the memory sharper rather than duller. He could feel again the paralysis spell pinning him in place, while events moved past too quickly to be stopped. When he finished, silence hung for a moment. Then from Bill's bed Fleur said with a tremor of fury that made her accent flash hard as steel, "Zot, coward." "No," Harry said at once, and startled himself with the vehemence. "He isn't a coward." The words tasted like poison. "He's worse." McGonagall's head lifted. She looked at Harry with a searching intensity that, had he been less shattered, he might have thought strange. Then she turned away sharply as if reminded of something she could not bear and could not reveal. Outside, above all the human noise, there rose suddenly a song. It came through the stone itself, or seemed to. A thread of sound so pure and mournful that everyone in the room stilled as though enchanted. Fawkes. The Phoenix lament traveled down the corridors and across the waking castle, touched the windows, the staircases, the rafters of the great hall, and made all of Hogwarts listen. It was grief without self-pity, grief that knew burning and return, and therefore did not flatter itself that loss was the end of all things. Yet to Harry, who knew nothing of return and believed utterly in endings just then, it seemed unbearable. Ginny began to cry in earnest. Hagrid buried his face in both hands. Even McGonagall shut her eyes. The song went on and on. In the middle of it, so quietly that only Harry and perhaps Madame Pomfrey noticed, a single scarlet feather drifted down inside the curtain and settled at the foot of the bed. McGonagall stared at it. Then, very deliberately, she bent, picked it up, and tucked it into her sleeve. A minute later she said, "Remus, stay here. Poppy with me, Kingsley if he has arrived." "No?" said Madame Pomfrey, incredulous through tears. "Now." Something passed between them, too quick for Harry to catch and too controlled to read. McGonagall looked once at the still figure on the bed, once at Harry, and for the briefest instant her expression seemed not only grief-struck, but guilty. Then she drew the curtain aside and was gone. It took all of McGonagall's training not to run. She moved through the hidden passage Fawkes had shown her with the rigid speed of someone walking inside a dream too terrible to question. The Phoenix led her not through any part of Hogwarts she knew, but out by an older way. A forgotten service tunnel that opened beyond the village, where Kingsley Shacklebolt waited already cloaked and watchful in the shadows behind the Hog's Head. Madame Pomfrey came behind, muttering under her breath about madness, dereliction, and old men who had no moral right to surprise their healers. Above them, the village slept with the heavy innocence of those temporarily spared. The pub door admitted them without a sound because Aberforth himself opened it, and seeing McGonagall's face, said only, "Upstairs." The room at the top smelled of dust and old grief. McGonagall stepped inside and stopped so suddenly Kingsley nearly walked into her. Albus Dumbledore lay half upright in a narrow bed under a patched blanket, looking at once undeniably alive and much nearer death than the castle below had guessed. The candlelight was merciless to him. It showed every hollow under the skin, every deepened line, the waxen strain around his mouth. One sleeve had been cut away. His blackened hand lay uncovered on the blanket like some cursed relic. Yet his blue eyes were open and unmistakably present. Fawkes sat at the bed's foot, a small red-gold blaze in the dimness. McGonagall did not cry out. Shock took even sound from her. She crossed the room with both hands lifted as though to touch a vision that might vanish if handled too firmly. "Albus," she whispered. "My dear Minerva," he said. The steadiness of his voice, thin though it was, undid her far more efficiently than any apparition could have. She gripped the bedrail and bowed her head once, hard. When she looked up again, her face was wet, and anger already burned through the tears. "You let us believe." "I did." "You let the boy believe." "Yes." "How dare you?" Kingsley, who had remained by the door as if physically bracing the room against upheaval, bowed his head briefly in greeting and said nothing. Madame Pomfrey had gone straight to the bedside and was already pulling instruments from her bag with the clipped savagery of a healer, confronted by a patient too important to throttle. "Pulse weak," she muttered. "Magical reserves depleted. Curse progression unchanged. Poison trauma still active. Merlin, help me. Have you been drinking the Mediterranean?" "North Sea," Aberforth said from the wall. "Not helpful." McGonagall did not take her eyes from Dumbledore. "No." "He did. Not the whole of it. Not yet. But enough. He spoke of Draco's mission, of the necessity of preserving the boy's soul if at all possible, of Severus's vow to Narcissa and the cover that must be maintained at any cost, of Harry's connection to Voldemort, and the impossibility of trusting any knowledge placed unshielded in the boy's heart, while the Dark Lord might at any time reach through rage and accident into his mind. He spoke of the ancient defensive enchantments woven into Hogwarts long before any of them had been born, and of one particular contingency he had prepared in the tower when it became obvious that Draco's plan was nearing its end. A simulacrum raised from the stone itself, bound to his likeness, and sustained by the castle's own will for a short span, enough to deceive eye and touch alike on the ground. He spoke of Severus knowing only when to strike and where. He did not speak of how close failure had come. He did not speak of Harry's face under the cloak. Those were details too intimate with regret. Kingsley asked the practical questions first. "Who knows?" "In this room," Dumbledore said. "My brother Severus and now you. No one else. For how long? As long as we can bear." McGonagall turned away, pressing one fist to her lips. "You ask for my help in enacting your funeral?" "Yes." Her shoulders stiffened. "You ask me to stand before children who love you and mourn to their faces for a death I know to be a lie." "For a protection," Dumbledore corrected gently. "Not a lie, though it will feel the same." She rounded on him. "Do not soften this." "I do not intend to." The rebuke in his own gentleness landed harder than any defense would have. McGonagall's chin lifted. She looked suddenly as she had looked in harder years, under harder skies, when the school had needed not comfort but iron. "And Harry?" she said. When the knowledge will not endanger Severus, Draco, or the war entire." "That is not an answer." "No," Dumbledore said, and the weariness in him seemed for a moment bone-deep. "It is not, but it is all the answer I possess." Madame Pomfrey made an impatient sound. She had finished the first sweep of charms, and was staring down at the cursed hand with professional fury, and beneath it, helplessness. "This should have killed you months ago," she said. "The potion tonight might finish what the curse began. If you imagine yourself leading campaigns from a dramatic bed of pain, kindly imagine again. I bow to your superior judgment. You may bow when I permit it." To everyone's astonishment, Kingsley laughed once. The sound broke something tight in the room. Even Aberforth's mouth twitched. "Can the body remain convincing?" Kingsley asked. "The simulacrum will hold while it remains within Hogwarts bounds and under the concealment already placed," Dumbledore said. "Once sealed in the tomb, it need hold no longer. The world need only believe the ceremony. The Ministry will want to see him. Then let them see what they expect." Kingsley's face, grave and dark and capable, settled into the expression of a man measuring risk and deciding it's still preferable to the alternative. I can manage the ministry's appetite for a little while. Shock will do half the work. Rufus will be rattled. Many will. If word spreads that you died at the school's own tower, there will be panic and anger enough to blind them. Now, there has already been panic, McGonagall said quietly, and anger will not wait for the morning. No, said Dumbledore. It will not. For a little while, only the quiet business of healing filled the room. Vials uncorked, spells murmured, bandages unwound, Aberforth sent for hot water and returning with it slopping over the rim because his hands were less steady than he liked to think. Fawkes watched all of them with inhuman patience. At last McGonagall said, without looking up, "He will hate Severus." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "and you are willing to spend that." The question hung. Kingsley looked away. Madame Pomfrey paused with a bandage in her hand. Aberforth, by the washstand, made no pretense of not listening. Dumbledore answered only after a long moment. "I am willing," he said, "to spend whatever I own if it buys the boy his chance. My reputation, my comfort, his affection, if it must be. But I do not spend them lightly, Minerva. Believe that much of me at least." The old witch closed her eyes. When she opened them again, command had returned. "Very well," she said. "The school will mourn. The body will be prepared. A funeral will be arranged. The circle remains this small, unless circumstance tears it open. Kingsley will handle the ministry. Poppy will threaten us all with death if we mishandle our patient. And if you die in truth after making us complicit in this monstrous performance, I shall haunt you myself." Dumbledore inclined his head from the pillow. "I should deserve nothing less." Kingsley stepped to the bed at last and offered his hand. Dumbledore took it with his left. The grip, though weakened, was still unmistakably Dumbledore's. "Welcome back," Kingsley said quietly. Dumbledore's eyes moved past him, toward the shuttered window in the direction of the castle beyond. "For the moment," he said. Before dawn, Severus Snape stood in the entrance hall of Malfoy Manor with the taste of smoke in his mouth, and Draco Malfoy sagging against the carved stone, as if all the strings that had been holding him upright since evening had finally been cut. The house was awake, though not with wholesome life. Lamps had been lit in too many rooms at once. Shadows moved behind high windows. Somewhere above, a peacock screamed from the grounds with the wounded vanity of the place itself. The great hallway smelled of wax, rose attar, cold marble, and fear. Narcissa came first. She must have been waiting for the sound of arrival, for she appeared at the head of the staircase before either of them had fully crossed the hall, pale silk gown trailing, one hand clutching the banister hard enough to whiten the knuckles. When she saw Draco, she did not descend with dignity. She ran. "My son." She took him by the face first, then by both shoulders, then crushed him against her with a desperate force that made him wince. He had not cried on the tower. He had not cried in the lane where they apparated. He did not cry now. But Severus saw his hands clutch at his mother's sleeves like a drowning man finding wood. "It's done," Narcissa whispered, looking up over Draco's shoulder at Severus. Severus inclined his head once. The relief that crossed her face was terrible to see. It was not joy. It was merely the loosening of a noose by 1 inch. Bellatrix entered a moment later in a rush of black silk and delighted malice. "I knew it," she said. "I knew you would do it, Severus. I knew my sweet nephew would not fail if properly directed." Draco flinched visibly. Bellatrix either did not see or did not care. She seized both his shoulders and kissed his forehead with feverish triumph, then turned those bright fanatic eyes on Severus. "How did he look?" she asked. "Did he beg? Did he know?" Severus removed his gloves finger by finger and set them precisely on the hall table because that was easier than striking her. "He knew enough." Bellatrix laughed. Narcissa shot her a look so flatly hateful that for an instant, the sisters' resemblance vanished entirely. "Draco needs rest," Narcissa said. He needs to learn what glory feels like, Bellatrix retorted. What he needs, Severus said, letting enough command into his voice to slice across them both, is silence. Bellatrix's nostrils flared, but the dark mark on Severus's forearm had begun to burn in earnest, and all lesser disputes fled before that summons. He drew back the sleeve. The skull writhed scarlet black on his skin. Where? Bellatrix asked immediately, eager as a hound. Severus closed his hand over the mark and let the call guide him. Not here. Narcissa tightened her hold on Draco. For one fraction of a second her eyes met Severus over her son's bowed head, and he saw in them gratitude, dread, suspicion, and something like a question she dared not ask. Had Draco killed? Had there been blood? Had the thing she feared most come to pass under the cover of success? Severus answered with the smallest shake of his head. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, some private terror had eased by exactly 1 degree. He apparated to the summons and arrived in a ruined drawing room miles away, where Lord Voldemort stood before a dead fireplace, as if he had grown there from the dark. No matter how often Severus looked upon him, the shock of that face had never become ordinary. It was not merely inhumanity that unsettled, though there was plenty of that in the pale, noseless visage and the slitted eyes. It was the sense that humanity had once been present and deliberately carved away in patient pieces. The remains wore a wizard's robes and held a wand. The rest was appetite and will. My lord, Severus said, and bowed. Severus! The voice was silk over a knife's edge. It always seemed to arrive slightly before the mouth moved. You have news. I do. Voldemort stepped closer. Nagini's absent hiss was strangely missed. For once the snake was elsewhere. The room smelled of damp plaster and extinguished fire. Outside, dawn had not yet broken. The windows showed only blackness. Tell me. Severus did. He described the tower, the disarmed headmaster, Draco's success in opening the way, the assembled Death Eaters, and finally the curse that sent Dumbledore over the battlements. He kept his mind as he had trained it for years, orderly, exact in chosen particulars, blank where it must be blank, a corridor of doors all closed, but the one he invited opened. It was labor. It was always labor. Tonight it felt like carrying molten lead barehanded. And you are certain? Voldemort asked softly when he had finished. I saw him fall, Severus said. The school mourns already. By sunrise all Britain will know. Nun. Voldemort's thin lips parted. It was not a smile. Not in any human sense. But satisfaction altered the face into something worse. The great Albus Dumbledore, he said, almost musingly. So ends the man they trusted to save them. Severus bowed his head further. Yes, my lord. For a long moment, Voldemort simply stood in silence, absorbing the fact like warmth. Then the red eyes sharpened. And the Elder Wand? He said. He had not yet placed it beyond my reach, I think. Severus's pulse gave one heavy beat. The body remained at Hogwarts, he said. I judged it wiser not to delay our escape for the sake of a wand while the school roused. That answer displeased. Displeasure in Voldemort was as subtle as a snake striking. The air in the room went colder. Perhaps, said the Dark Lord, you judged with too much caution. Perhaps, Severus said, because contradiction here was more dangerous than concession. Yet caution preserved Draco and preserved me to report to you. The wand may be taken from his tomb at leisure. A dead man will not defend it. That last was exactly the sort of contempt Voldemort admired. It eased the moment. The snake-pale head inclined. At leisure, Voldemort echoed. Yes, there will be time for tombs. He turned away, signaling dismissal, and also, more ominously, acceptance. Severus kept the bow long enough to be safe and left only when permitted. Back at the manor, dawn had begun to silver the east-facing windows. Narcissa had gotten Draco upstairs. Bellatrix waited below with the restless heat of someone denied a celebration. Well, she demanded. He is pleased. I knew it. Severus looked at her. Then know also that Draco is not to be paraded before him like a prize horse. He is exhausted. If you destroy what your sister values most in your eagerness to worship, she may finally decide blood has limits. Now, Bellatrix laughed, but the warning landed. Severus saw it in the narrowing of her eyes. When he was alone and at last, in a corridor lined with ancestral portraits pretending sleep, he let one hand brace briefly against the cold marble wall. He had done as asked. That was the phrase that would serve until it no longer could. It had carried him through years. Tonight, it tasted like ash. From somewhere above came the muffled sound of Draco being sick. Severus closed his eyes once, just once, then straightened and went to wash Hogwarts smoke from his sleeves. The days between the tower and the funeral passed in a distortion of time, either too fast to understand or so slowly that each hour bruised. News spread with indecent speed. By breakfast the whole school knew. By noon the prophet had owls in every village. By evening witches and wizards stood outside the gates with flowers, letters, and grief on public display. The ministry sent representatives, then demands, then condolences. Rufus Scrimgeour himself arrived in a face of official sorrow that did not fully hide the fear underneath. Hogwarts, stripped in one night of the man who had seemed its mind as much as its headmaster, altered around the loss. Corridors felt larger. Shadows collected in corners by afternoon. Students moved in clusters. Laughter, when it came at all, sounded wrong, like a remembered language spoken with the accent gone astray. Harry inhabited those days the way one inhabits a fever. Sleep brought the tower back with mechanical fidelity. Waking brought the knowledge that the tower had not vanished in the night. He sat through conversations and remembered none of them. He answered questions because faces expected answers. He hated the pity in the younger students. He hated the suspicion in some older ones when Snape's name arose, as though treachery were something to be weighed academically. He hated every moment in which the world went on with practical requirements. Meals, washing, letters, planning, as if routine were not a vulgarity in the presence of disaster. At some point he realized he had not once cried since the night itself. It seemed either a failure or a reprieve. He could not tell which. On the morning of the funeral, summer broke fully over the grounds. The sky came up clear and blue. Sunlight lay across the lake in broad sheets of silver. The beauty of it felt almost insulting. Chairs had been arranged near the white marble tomb newly raised beside the black water, a structure of such severe grace that it looked less built than brought to the surface from some buried older world. People came in dark robes from all directions. Students, order members, ministry officials, foreign witches and wizards. Old acquaintances Harry did not know and younger ones who had known Dumbledore only by reputation. The centaurs stood half seen at the edge of the forest, tall and watchful among the trees. Something moved beneath the surface of the lake, merpeople perhaps, drawn by ceremony or curiosity or respect. Hagrid was dressed in black that sat on him like mourning armor. He had insisted, Harry knew, on bearing the body himself. The task seemed to be holding him upright. McGonagall moved among the assembled mourners with a composure so complete it had become terrible. Harry remembered her in the hospital wing, face broken open by the first sight of the body, and understood that everything she possessed of discipline had since been turned outward like a shield. Kingsley stood not far from her, speaking in low tones to ministry officials, and somehow making each of them more orderly merely by existing. Madame Pomfrey sat very straight with both hands clasped in her lap and looked as if she had not slept a minute in 3 nights. Ginny came to stand beside Harry without speaking. Ron and Hermione sat with them, pressed close by the density of chairs and by something more voluntary than that. When Harry glanced at Ginny, he saw the same thing he had seen since the tower. Not childish weeping, though tears had come, but fury yoked to grief and carrying it somehow. Music began, though Harry never afterward remembered who conjured it or whether it came from instruments at all. It seemed simply to rise around the tomb, low and grave. Then Hagrid came forward. For one terrible second, Harry's vision blurred so badly that he thought he might at last break apart there in full view of everyone. Hagrid walked slowly, each step a labor, carrying Dumbledore wrapped in pale robes that caught the sun. The face was visible. It still looked like Dumbledore. If there was any strangeness in it, distance and ritual and Harry's own refusal erased the possibility of noticing. He saw only the beloved outline, the white beard against the black of Hagrid's sleeve, the folded hands, the stillness. He did not know that across the grounds, hidden by a weave of disillusionment and old woodland shadow at the forest's edge, Albus Dumbledore watched his own funeral with one hand braced against a beech trunk to remain standing. Aberforth stood beside him in rough dark robes, hat low over his eyes, every line of him skeptical of the entire arrangement, and yet unwilling to leave. Fawkes, who had not been seen publicly since the song that haunted the night after the tower, perched above them on a high branch and made of his silence a thing almost audible. Albus had insisted on coming. Poppy had called it murderous vanity. Minerva had called it unthinkable. Aberforth had called it, with some justice, exactly the sort of idiocy he ought to have anticipated from a brother who had once staged his own death on school grounds, and then wanted a front-row seat to the consequences. Yet in the end, none of them had prevented it, partly because no charm set by others had ever proved entirely proof against Dumbledore, and partly because they understood, however unwillingly, that there are griefs a man must witness if he means to ask others to bear them. So he stood hidden and watched Hagrid lower the simulacrum into place before the tomb. He watched Minerva's profile remain hard and perfect in the sun. He watched Kingsley intercept Scrimgeour at precisely the right moment to prevent the minister from attempting some public intimacy that would have revealed more than either wanted. He watched Severus nowhere, because Severus could not be there. He watched the students in their rows, faces turned upward like a field of pale flowers in stormless weather. And he watched Harry. Distance did not blur the boy for him. Not really. Harry's grief was visible even from there, not because it had broken into tears, but because it had done something harder, folded inward and sharpened. He looked older. Not taller, not more physically changed, but older, as if the night on the tower had stripped something away faster than the body could follow. Beside him, Ginny stood with one shoulder nearly touching his. Ron and Hermione bracketed him like vows. Albus had expected pain. He had not expected the almost physical urge to end the deception then and there, to walk from the trees down the lawn and let every careful plan crack open under the force of simple human refusal. He could imagine it with dangerous clarity, Harry's face lifting in disbelief, the ripple through the crowd, Minerva's rage turning at once into relief, so violent it would probably become another sort of rage. He could imagine, too, what would follow when Voldemort learned by whatever channel he always seemed to learn that Severus's greatest service had been false, that Draco had been spared by trickery, that Albus lived. Deaths uncountable. Plans burned to the root. The war narrowed again to the strong preying on the trusting. He remained where he was. The service itself blurred for him in places, not because he fainted, though the effort cost dearly, but because grief moved oddly when it doubled back upon its owner. He heard pieces, an old colleague speaking of Dumbledore's brilliance, a former student speaking of kindnesses done in private and forgotten publicly. Hagrid saying almost nothing because he could not. The hush as the body was raised by magic and sealed within the tomb of white marble. Harry did not look away at any point. Neither did Minerva. When the tomb closed, Fawkes sang. The sound came from above the lake and the trees and the castle towers all at once, a phoenix song so wild and pure that conversation died before it began. Heads lifted. Faces turned skyward. Some wept then who had not wept before. Even Aberforth's fingers tightened at his sides. Fawkes sang of burning and surviving, of endings that were not final and losses that nonetheless scarred exactly as if they were. The song broke over the gathered mourners like sunlight through rain. To them it must have seemed farewell. To Albus it was not farewell at all, but fidelity, and that made it crueler in its way, because fidelity could not absolve. When the last note faded, the ground seemed lonelier than before. The crowd began slowly to break apart. Ministry officials murmured. Students clustered. Hagrid stood before the sealed tomb with both hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Scrimgeour approached Harry and was intercepted again, this time by Minerva, who did not even pretend to politeness. Ginny touched Harry's sleeve. Hermione wiped her face and failed entirely to hide the fact. Ron stared at the marble as if he wished it would explain everything. Albus reached, blindly for a moment, toward the tree because the strength in his legs had gone uncertain. "Enough," Aberforth muttered. "In a moment. You're white as a shroud. A fitting color today." Aberforth made a disgusted sound, but he shifted half a step closer in case support became necessary. Albus kept his eyes on Harry. He had asked the boy for courage before. He would ask for more yet. Watching him sit through his own funeral and carry the weight of it without protest, Albus understood with a fresh and punishing clarity that every future request would be made of someone already overburdened. The castle emptied slowly after the funeral, not because people wished to leave, but because no one knew how. Harry escaped as soon as he decently could. He needed air unbroken by condolence, by ministry voices, by the peculiar pressure that surrounded public grief when too many people wanted to honor the dead, and in doing so made the mourner feel pinned to a board like a specimen. He walked without aim along the edge of the grounds until the lake lay quiet to his right, and the tomb, white and flawless in the lowering sun, was far enough behind to be seen whole. He heard Ginny before he saw her. Her footsteps were light, but grief had sharpened his senses into something almost animal. "You run badly when you're trying not to be followed," she said. He stopped. She came up beside him and faced the lake rather than him, which was a mercy. The evening light gathered in her hair and turned it to copper fire. Her face was composed in that determined way he already knew meant she was holding emotion by main force. "I thought you'd want to be alone," Harry said. "I thought you'd say that." For a little while they stood side by side without speaking. The lake took the sun in long molten streaks. Somewhere across the grounds someone called to someone else. A door banged faintly. The ordinary sounds of an evening at Hogwarts returned one by one, each seeming indecent and then, after a moment, necessary. "I'm leaving," Harry said. She did not ask what he meant. Perhaps she had known before he did. "Not just the school," he added. "I'm not coming back next year, if there is a next year like that." Ginny kept looking at the water. "Because of what he told you." Harry turned to her, startled. "How do you know he told me anything?" "Because I know you," she said simply. "And because you've looked since Christmas like someone carrying a secret too heavy to fit properly inside your skin." He almost smiled at that and found he could not. The ache in his chest had changed since the funeral. It was no longer only the blunt fact of Dumbledore's absence. It was becoming direction, and direction frightened him more because it left less room for numbness. "There are things I have to do," he said. Things he wanted finished. "Then finish them." She said it with such immediate fierceness that he stared. "You make it sound easy." "I don't," she said. "I make it sound necessary." The wind shifted off the lake. Harry could smell summer grass, sun-warmed stone, the faint sweetness of nearby flowers. Everything beautiful in the evening seemed sharpened by the knowledge that danger moved through the same air. "I can't be with you," he said. Ginny closed her eyes once. When she opened them, they were bright but dry. "I guessed that too." Harry felt suddenly younger than he had in days, and much more miserable. "It isn't because I don't. I know. I mean it. I know, Harry." He faced her then because to speak while looking anywhere else felt cowardly. "Voldemort uses people. He always has. If he knows, if anyone knows, you matter to me." "I matter to you whether we're together or not," she said, and the quiet accuracy of it cut straight through him. He had no answer to that. It was the truth, and truth offered no shelter. Ginny drew a breath. But if what you mean is you won't let me become a visible target in a war you think is yours alone, then say that honestly. I don't think it's mine alone. You act like it. That's because everyone who comes near it gets hurt. She turned fully toward him now. Everyone is already near it. That's the point. The force of her was one of the things he loved. He let himself think the word exactly once, because saying it aloud now would only make the parting worse, and because not saying it did not lessen its truth. I can't ask you to wait, he said. Good, Ginny replied, and there was a flash of her old temper in it. Because I wouldn't. I'm not a hat on a shelf for you to come back to. Despite everything, a breath of laughter escaped him. It turned almost at once into something shakier. She took one step closer and touched his hand. Not clung to it. Not pleaded. Simply took it, warm and real and steadying. I knew this might happen, she said. When I started being stupid about you. When you kissed me after the match. When everything got good enough that I should have been suspicious. No. Nothing about it was stupid. That, she said, is arguable. He looked at her hand over his and thought with sudden, unbearable clarity of ordinary futures. Walking beside her to breakfast, Quidditch arguments, stolen hours by the lake, the kind of life where danger existed in the background and not in the center. The grief for Dumbledore and the grief for that imagined life touched and became briefly indistinguishable. I'm sorry. Ginny's mouth trembled once. I'm furious with you. I know. I'm also furious with you-know-who, and with Bellatrix Lestrange, and with every lunatic in Britain who thinks this is a good time to turn evil into a hobby. So don't get too flattered. He bowed his head. Then she did something much worse than weeping. She smiled at him. It was a small, brave, damaged smile, and it nearly undid him. Come here, she said. He did. She kissed him, and it was not the desperate kiss of people pretending parting doesn't exist, but the clear one of two people who know exactly what they are giving up and mean to honor it by not lying. When they stepped apart, the evening had deepened by some invisible degree. I'll still want you to come back, Ginny said. I know. You're allowed to survive for selfish reasons too, you realize. I'll keep that in mind. Doe. She let go of his hand first. Then, because she was Ginny, and because dignity mattered to her even in pain, she nodded once and walked away toward the castle without looking back. Harry stood where she had left him until Ron and Hermione found him. They did not speak of Ginny. Hermione's eyes were swollen red. Ron looked exhausted clear through. They came to either side of him with the hesitant purpose of people offering company that may or may not be wanted but is not, under any likely answer, optional. We're coming, Ron said. Harry knew at once what he meant. No. Ron made an impatient noise. Don't be thick. I mean it. So do I. Hermione folded her arms. You cannot possibly have believed we'd let you wander off alone to do whatever mad thing Dumbledore set in motion. It isn't safe. Brilliant, said Ron. Then we'd better come. Harry looked from one to the other and felt something in him loosen that he had not realized was clenched. Friendship, like grief, was ugly in the living of it. Stubborn, poorly timed, unwilling to accept reasonable refusals. It was also the only thing in the world just then that made the road ahead look remotely human. I'm not going back to school, he said. Neither are we, said Hermione. Ron nodded. Mum'll be thrilled. She'll try to stop you. So, Harry wanted to argue further. He could feel the outline of all the arguments and knew they would fail. Not because Ron and Hermione were being foolish, though perhaps they were, but because they had already chosen on older grounds than logic. At last he said, There are more Horcruxes. Hermione inhaled sharply. Ron swore under his breath. Neither stepped back. Harry went on. He told them what Dumbledore had told him, as much as he knew. Not every detail of the cave. Some of that still felt too raw. But enough. The 6 fragments, the cup, and the snake, and the unknown things still hidden. The necessity of finding and destroying them before Voldemort could truly be defeated. As he spoke, the task stopped being abstract and became again what it was: impossible, urgent, and the only road left. When he finished, Hermione was pale but composed. Ron stared at the ground a moment and then said, with weird calm, "All right, that's your response? What? Do you want a speech?" "No." "Good. Because I haven't got one." "Yeah. Oh." They began walking back together toward the castle, 3 dark figures on the grass with the white tomb behind them and the last of the sun. None of them looked back, though all 3 felt it. Far off among the trees, unseen by any of them, Fawkes shifted on his branch and gave one low note like a single-struck thread of gold. That night, after the last condolence had been spoken, and the final torches along the path to the tomb had burned down to red stubs, Albus Dumbledore stood before the marble that now bore his name. The grounds were emptied of everyone but ghosts, caretakers, and one hidden old man who had arranged to become both. Moonlight silvered the lawn. The lake was a black plate. Hogwarts rose beyond in layered shadow and a scattered pattern of lit windows where grief, insomnia, or duty kept company. The tomb itself shone pale enough to seem self-luminous, a piece of carved moon fallen to earth. Aberforth waited some yards off with all the patient irritation of a man who knew this vigil would matter and resented it on principle. Fawkes sat on Albus' shoulder, warm through the cloth of his robe. The white marble was colder than he expected when he laid his hand against it. He had seen monuments raised before. He had stood beside too many graves. Never once had he imagined the odd estrangement of touching one's own. For a while he said nothing. Words would have been vanity at first. The silence between a man and his own tomb ought to be granted a little dignity. At last he murmured, "Well, you are handsomer in stone than I ever managed in life." Aberforth snorted from the dark. "If you start admiring the workmanship, I'm leaving." "Stay. I shall be brief. You said that about the summer of 1899. Albus closed his eyes briefly. "A wound cleanly struck. Only because you keep handing me the knife." The rebuke, like most of Aberforth's, was kinder than it sounded. Albus let it rest there between them. The night accepted all things without comment. Regret, sarcasm, moonlight, the distant rustle of leaves where something small hunted or fled. He thought of Harry standing at this same tomb in the daylight, face changed by grief and resolve. He thought of Minerva conducting a funeral with iron in her spine, and rage banked under it like fire in a stove. He thought of Severus washing smoke from his sleeves in some enemy house, hated by the only people whose hatred could still wound him. He thought of Draco sick in his mother's arms, soul preserved for now, and perhaps permanently, if enough were done rightly after. He thought of the war widening around all of them because it would not wait politely while love and pain were sorted. "It cannot remain so small," Kingsley had said earlier that evening in Ariana's room, standing with a map on his knee and the ministry's latest foolishness folded in his pocket. "Your secret, I mean. Not forever." "No," Albus had answered. "Only until the next necessary cruelty." Now, at the tomb, he understood with a steadier bleakness that death had not lessened the requirement for calculation. It had merely sharpened it. The world would give him no credit for wisdom exercised in shadow, no comfort of trust openly bestowed. Good. Comfort had become a luxury. Credit, an irrelevance. He had asked for the advantage of invisibility. It now fell to him to earn the ugliness of it. He turned from the marble at last. "We begin at once," he said. Aberforth shifted, alert despite himself. "With what?" "Kingly duties for Kingsley. A school to be guarded through Minerva. A serpent to be followed through Severus. Safe houses prepared before panic makes them precious. The ministry nudged where it can still be nudged and circumvented where it cannot. The boy watched, but not touched. Not yet." "And you?" Albus smiled, tired and flint-edged. "I shall do what old men are best suited for. I shall interfere." Aberforth grunted. Thought as much. They began to walk back toward the line of trees, where the disillusionment charm thickened into shelter. Halfway there, Albus stopped and looked once more over his shoulder. The tomb gleamed on the lawn, serene and final to any eye but his. Behind it, Hogwarts stood vast and dark against the stars, a castle full of sleeping children and wakeful losses, of ancient stones that had once answered his need and might yet answer others. Somewhere inside, Harry would be lying rigid in a bed or staring out a dormitory window, imagining himself more alone than he truly was. Albus could not mend that yet. He could only work toward the day when explanation would no longer be a weapon turned against them. Fawkes spread his wings slightly, balancing on the old man's shoulder. The phoenix's warmth was living fire. Albus drew his cloak closer around himself and stepped into the forest shadow. Behind him, the world had buried Albus Dumbledore. What remained would have to be subtler, harsher, and patient enough to wage war from inside the grave.